My question is, how closely was the idea of collective houses connected with social, economic, and political crisis? The reason why I ask this question is that the current Czech co-housing or Czech Baugruppen or Czech other forms of collective living in Czech Republic nowadays did not actually emerge in the 1990s, nor did they emerge after the year 2000. Instead, they are slowly starting to appear only in the last few years, at the turn of the last economic crisis of 2008, to be precise. Here you can see some excerpts, some pages from the booklet which was issued together with an exhibition of Berlin Baugruppe, the exhibition held in Prague. And this exhibition of collective living, collective housing, was a great success with a huge interest, mainly from the students. Of course, there is one strong historical argument about why the post-communist society so immediately after the fall of communism did not seek to live collectively. Why it took 25 years to re-establish some forms of collective housing, collective living. This argument runs that the post-communist society was fed up with some kind of false collectiveness, and instead it longed for individuality. So it took 25 years to recover the idea of co-housing, collective housing in a post-communist society. Additionally, the collective houses built in Czechoslovakia in the 1970s and in the 1980s were of rather poor quality. They served usually as a dormitory for part-time workers in huge industrial enterprises in Czechoslovakia. That is why they might be as well be considered some sort of a monument, a monument of the past regime, a monument that almost everyone wanted to forget, almost everyone wanted to exclude from the collective memory. So why is it then that 25 years later, people who still remember the grayness of late communism, why these people in the Czech Republic recently start to search for collective living, for some sorts, some forms of collective housing, co-housing? Is it a coincidence, or is it probably a result of the crisis of 2008? Is there something about a crisis that can serve as an impulse to search for collective housing rather than an individual one? If we look at the history as such, and then at the history of housing, we can see that two episodes of the history of Czech collective housing actually overlap with times of deep turmoil, with times of deep crisis. Theoretician Karl Teiger, here you can see him on the right picture, in the middle having fun in the swimming pool at Villa Crocha in Brno. Theoretician Karl Teiger formulated his vision of collective housing during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. In 1932, the left picture, in 1932, in the very collapse of the Czech economy, he published his book, The Minimum Dwelling, Name and Shibit. And this book was a manifest of collective housing. This manifest was then followed by many proposals by Czech architects, like one of them, Pars pro toto, this one by architect Jiří Voženilek, proposal from 1931, the name of Jiří Voženilek will appear again, will pop up again after the World War II. After World War II, 15 years later after Taiga, the collective houses in Czech industrial towns of Litvinov and Zlín were built, and they appeared right after the war, during the period of great uncertainty, during the period of fear of the future, fear of inflation, fear of shortages in supply of basic living goods, and fear of the change of political situation, of course. Both of these cases, this one from the Great Depression and this one from early post-war era, both of these cases, the Great Depression and post-war period, can be described as the American sociologist Peter M. Sorokin already did in 1942. Sorokin says, because of the deep crisis, the social ties are weakening, the attention of individuals is focused on ensuring a minimum standard of living necessary for survival. Crisis destroys the society. Crisis destroys the society. So the intellectual elites, not even architectural, but intellectual elites, that were aware of the social impact of the crisis, these elites were looking for any tool that could actually prevent the collapse of the social structures, that could prevent the collapse of the society. And architecture, or more specifically, a collective house, was seen as one of such tools, as a tool that could prevent the collapse of social norms, as a tool that could prevent a collapse of the society. The term collective house, in Czech we use the term koldum, so koldum or collective house, describes a building which serves as a permanent residence for families or individuals. The residential component of the building, of the koldum, of collective house, is generally formed by single-family flats or minimal studios, some kind of minimal living cells for individuals. But koldum comprises both a residential component and a wide range of centralized services, civic amenities. Here you can see the collective house in Litvinov, and in the central wing there are lots of civic amenities, public spaces, or semi-public spaces serving exclusively or primarily for the residents of this particular building. A residential component and a wide range of centralized services, residential, service and social functions are combined within a single building. And these service and social functions are of great importance during the crisis. Canteens, various club areas, hobby spaces, recreation and sport facilities, libraries, reading rooms, lecture halls, all these collective areas are of great importance during the crisis. The first main character of my lecture will be the Czech theoretician Karel Taiga, the one already mentioned. His interest in collectiveness started already in mid-1920s. However, with the coming of the Great Depression in 1929, this interest underwent a sharp ideological radicalization. The new impulse for collective housing was based on Marxism and also, of course, on Lenin's actual attempts at creating a new socialist man. Following the Soviet architects, following Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Following these examples, Taige's thinking about the architecture had radicalized, it had changed. Taige began to view architectural practice itself as an exact science grounded in Marxist social analysis, as this quotation illustrates. However, the ideological blinkers so willingly assumed by Taige prevented him quite effectively from understanding the real needs of the working class during the Great Depression. A central place in his vision of collective housing, in his vision of Koldum, was occupied by his growing belief that the revolutionary potential of the working class is on its rise. Collective house was intended to accelerate this revolutionary potential. It was meant as a tool that would accelerate the upcoming Bolshevik revolution. Taige, at least at this point, was completely and utterly wrong. The idea that the class consciousness of the workers is rising as a result of the economic crisis. So this idea was refuted by research in Austria, in Poland, right from the edge of the 1930s. Research made by three Austrian leftist sociologists, Maria Jahoda, Paul Lazarsfeld, and Hans Zeissel. This research proved that there is no revolution coming to town, that there is no revolution coming as a direct result of the Great Depression. They had observed a settlement of Marienthal. It was an industrial community which, after a bankruptcy of a local factory, was hit by almost 100% unemployment. They published the research in 1933, and their research was clear. Unemployed workers are not interested in any political activity. Unemployed workers are not interested in any group activity. Deep material deprivation, crisis, economical collapse does not generate any individual or group activity within the collective of the workers. While there were many political parties in the town of Marienthal before 1930, there was none after the economic collapse. Sociology in the early 1930s torpedoed the belief that the revolution follows immediately the moment of economic breakdown. Taige and his fellow architects just did not want to admit that Austrian sociologists are right. They just didn't want to admit that a deep crisis has already caused a situation where nobody expects any change. In 1932, an architect, Jiří Krocha, Brno-based architect, an ally of Taige, a colleague of Taige, created a very interesting set of collages called Sociological Fragment of Housing. And this set of collages illustrated the daily timetables of members of different social classes, and what one would hardly find any notion about the daily timetable of an unemployed worker here. Also, Karl Taige, on more than 400 pages of his book, The Minimum Dwelling, paid no attention to the time schedule of an unemployed worker. Both Taige in Brno and Krocha in Prague just firmly believed that architecture is able to prevent the breakup of the progressive social and political structures that might have been eroded by the crisis, but still are strong enough to generate revolution. Taige, being a Marxist, asked a crucial question whether building collective houses, like, for example, those proposed by Czech architects in the early 1930s, you can see one of them, it is a proposal for a collective house of the communist cooperative Včela, in English, a bee. So Taige asked a crucial question whether building these collective houses in capitalist Czechoslovakia is utopia or is it politics? Is it utopia or is it politics? And he answered dialectically, as far as collective house would be a tool of mobilizing the masses, would be a tool that could help generate revolution, everything is right. Only in case the collective house turned it into autarky, into a happy utopian island, into something isolated from the outside world, into something that prevented revolution. So in this case, it's no use to build a collective house. Collective houses should not be a utopian vision, should not be a ready-to-go takeaway solution, but should rather become an ever-developing structure that could serve as a tool of strengthening class consciousness of workers, ever-developing structure that could generate the Bolshevik Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Here you can see another example, a housing estate comprising several collective houses. Also, this proposal from 1930 was not built, not realized. Ever-developing structure that could serve as a tool of criticism of liberal politics, as a tool for revolutionary mobilization of the working class. None of these two buildings, none of these two proposals, and many others, these are only two examples, so none of them was actually built. Even a communist cooperative did not want to build a collective house. However, there was one building that gave Czech avant-garde and Karl Taige a solid guidance about those methods of strengthening of class consciousness. It was not a collective house in the strict sense of the word. It was a boarding school built for the German trade unions in the city of Brno, near Berlin, by architect Hannes Meyer. Hannes Meyer described this school as a sort of a housing commune, as a first embryonic attempt on the way to collective houses. The workers stayed here for monthly training sessions, and the mayor's aim was to create a cohesive and structured team of workers during that short time of 1 month, of 4 weeks. 120 students were split into groups, 2 comrades in one dormitory room, and 10 comrades dormitory room, the picture on top above. So 2 comrades in 1 dormitory room, 10 comrades in the canteen, in the classroom, and of the entire building, only an auditorium, a lecture hall, was intended for all 120 participants of the course. Yeah, thank you. Karel Teiger was really impressed by this solution. The trade union school seemed to him as a place where crisis has just no place to hide, where crisis of social structures, inflation of social norms has just no place to hide, where this crisis, this inflation of social norms is completely eradicated by scientific methods. This was done in Teiger's eyes, of course, with a little help from architects. So to conclude this first part about Karel Teiger, I want to stress that the most important thing about how he understood collective houses was that they are immune to the crisis. A collective house is a place where crisis has no impact on social structures. And now let's have a look at the situation after World War II. After World War II, collective houses seem to be appropriate, especially for industrial cities. And 2 collective houses were actually built in post-war Czechoslovakia. The first one, the picture above, the first one built by the chemical factory Stalinovy Závody, or Stalin Works in English. This house was designed by architects Václav Chilsky and Evgen Linhart. It was built in western Bohemian town of, or city of Litvinov. The second collective house, it was designed by the architect Jiří Voženílek, the former ally of Karel Teiger. Jiří Voženílek, he cooperated with the shoe company Baťa. This second collective house was built in Zlín in the late 1940s. Neither of these post-war collective houses was a result of Marxism. Neither of these 2 was a result of communism. Their concept was formulated during the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia by the management of Baťa Shoe Company. So it was rather a result of welfare capitalism, not Marxism or communism. Before World War II, we would not find any serious consideration of collective housing in this company, in Zlín. During the 1930s, the garden city colonies were built on the hills around the city of Zlín, and according to the company, these houses acknowledged the right of employees to free individual development, not only of their family life, but also of their personality. While the operation of the factory, as the argument ran, while the operation of the factory was based on collectiveness, this garden city was supposed to cultivate individuality. During World War II, this attitude changed. The new director of the company, his name was Hugo Vavrečka, has written some comments on industrial city planning, and in his comments, all the advantages of the garden city, all the hygienic, health, political advantages of the garden city gave way to the view that the industrial city should be a one cohesive social unit. And let me quote, I think it's the core quotation from these comments written by the director of Batya Shoe Company. A hive of garden houses in itself is an absolutely anarchic unit, similar to mountain villages with scattered dwellings and the egoistic mentality of their inhabitants. If we set as the objective the cultivation of a modern, economically minded, socially and politically well-adjusted industrial person, we must allow such a person to live not only in a garden, in free and hygienic environment, but also in a socially cohesive settlement. Instead of the garden city, Director Wawreczka proposed collective houses with hotel service. Who should be housed in these collective buildings? They were intended for young families with children. Every house should provide a place for community for approximately 100 to 200 families, and a collective house finally built in Zlín was intended for 102 families. Why was this problem of egoistic mentality of inhabitants of Garden City? Why was this problem so crucial for the director of shoe company during World War II? During the time of war, it's somehow natural that we appreciate our family background. During war, we all are family types. But this does also mean that all other social ties in the society somehow erode if they survive at all. In 1958, American sociologist Edward C. Benfield coined a term, amoral familism. This term describes the following situation. In poor region, Benfield researched one region in southern Italy. So in poor region, during the crisis, the society is family-centric. Public interest, public good are left out. There are only families or informal groups of friends or mafia, some kind of family. All these family groups, all these families care for their own members only. They care for their own members at the expense of their fellow citizens, at the expense of the society. The most important problem of the family-based society is that it is unable to act together. It is unable to realize anything that is transcending the immediate material interest of one particular family. This term, amoral familism, was from 1970s on a quite popular term used to describe impact that war or economic crisis has on society. It was also used or applied on communist society. And I think both of Czech post-war collective houses reflect this problem of amoral familism. Amoral familism is in this sentence about the egoistic mentality of their inhabitants. We all are family types during wartime, and that is why utopian visions of Karel Tajge were abandoned during war and after World War II. We all are family types, and that is why Tajge's proposals were left out. Tajge and his fellow architects were inspired by Friedrich Engels, and he firmly believed that the family as an institution is falling apart. Emancipation of women in Soviet Union, or simulacrum of emancipation of women in Soviet Union, seemed to verify that in the new society, in socialist society, there will be no family. That socialist society will be, how to say it, family-free. And Karol Tajge writes very passionately about the matrimonial bed. He writes that the matrimonial bed is a hatching place of the most wretched forms of bourgeois sexual life, the stage of Strindbergian dramas, a roosting place of shocking erotic banality and decadence, and so on, and so on, and so on. Therefore, Tajge demands that in the future, in collective houses, there will be no family flat, no family living, no families, and thus no family flats. Instead of family flats, there will be only living cells for individuals. Here you can see one of them by Jan Giller, a close ally, colleague of Tajge. On the contrary, the Zlín collective house and also Litvinov collective house were built for families. They were not built for individuals, but they were built for families because we all are family types during wartime. Both attempted to find such a scale of the industrial city that would reflect basic elements of the society. The family, the working team in the factory, and the team of inhabitants of a collective house, or a house, of residential unit. The collective house in Zlín was completed during the uncertain post-war years, but it was created on an intellectual basis formulated within wartime. It was a child of chaos, it was a child of weak legitimacy of state structures, and first of all, it was a child of the dissolution of social norms. The story of Zlín collective house is somehow similar to that of Litvinov and its collective house. Stalinové závody, Stalin Works. It was a chemical plant, the successor of a German company established in 1939. During the war, the majority of unskilled personnel consisted of prisoners and forced labor. Specialists were recruited from ethnic Germans, and Germans were eventually expelled from Czechoslovakia after 1945. And the new Czech company's management faced a challenge in that it had to ensure the operations of the factory despite a critical shortage of employees. The director of the company, his name was Miloš Svitavský. So this director settled on the policy of employee benefits. He wanted high standard family housing with hotel service. His objective was to permanently bind employees to the factory, bind employees to the company, to the city, bind employees to the place of their residence in order to limit their unhealthy fluctuation. He just wanted to strengthen ties within a collective of workers of his company. But because we are all family types during wartime, he included family flats into his collective house. Both of these post-war collective houses were searching for a way to ensure social stability among employees of industrial enterprises, and both were intended to answer the question about the social impact of the crisis. And I really do not know the answer to the question whether co-housing or community housing or Baugruppen slowly emerging today in Czechoslovakia or in Czech Republic, if they are a direct answer to the crisis of 2008. But these two historical examples I presented suggest that there is something about it. Every time a crisis was knocking on our door in Czechoslovakia, the architects or intellectual elites were searching for collectiveness in architecture. Why today do Czech people in their 30s or 40s tend for collective living? I do not know the answer to this question. Most of them do remember the grayness of 1970s and 1980s in communist Czechoslovakia. They do remember the massive growth of immoral familism. Their parents surely do remember the erosion of working collectives. They do remember massive interest in handicrafts, Roman Krakowski mentioned in his lecture. They do remember interest in DIY, in gardening. All these activities were usually performed individually, and they were performed quite often with the expectation of an escape from the stultifying atmosphere of official collective living, collectiveness. Moreover, the frequent shortages of the socialist economy led to the creation of some kind of informal networks of economic self-help, usually within a family or within a close group of friends. So the idea of collective living as a place of strengthening esprit du corps, so this idea was completely lost any sense and legitimacy in late communist Czechoslovakia. After 1989, the brand new world of neoliberalism entered the country, and economic transition was presented as some kind of inevitable process with a great emphasis on individuality and small family businesses. And no surprise then that in the 1990s, these collective houses I presented, they were cast aside by the wider public as the component of the Soviet communism. I think present attempts at Czech housing may be seen as some kind of a backlash against the inevitability of neoliberal economy being transplanted into post-communist society. But the most interesting is that these attempts appeared around 2008 when almost everyone started to doubt neoliberalism itself. Almost everyone started to ask if neoliberalism is the best way we should keep on marching. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Hubert, for Hubert, I would like to ask you what was the status of collective houses during the period of socialist realism? What was the, you know, how they managed to survive and get, I mean, financing and being finished until 1958? What was the perception of the regime of those houses during the Stalinist period?
Because in the Soviet Union, collective houses were abandoned in early 1930s, and they appeared again in late 1950s. So there is a gap of 20 years or 30 years. And the similar situation was in Czechoslovakia when Václav Hilsky and Evgen Lindhardt started to build a collective housing in Litvinov. Everything was all right, but then came Ždanovism, came socialist realism, and there was a lot of critics about this building. The issue of architectural style was one of them, but the second one, and maybe most important, was that they were not prefabricated. So the issue that the speaker already mentioned, the prefabrication, they were so huge, so complicated that the prefabrication was not used in any of those post-war collective houses. When the socialist realism ended, around 1958, let's say, the issue of collective houses appeared again on this scene. It was mainly based on Soviet examples. It was there was some kind of difference because they were thought as not as a permanent residence, but as a long-term residence for young couples before they get a regular flat in prefab housing estates.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So are there any other questions about collective houses?
Well, what would be the Austrian view on that? I think I see three waves. We had a one kitchen house in Vienna, which was for built 1926, 7. Yeah. This was considered a it was a cooperative. It was a cooperative. This is fairly unique. It had to withstand the paternalistic solution from Red Vienna, which provided other types of housing. The interesting story is that when the Nazis came, they immediately introduced kitchens into the flats. This is the interwar story, and I wouldn't go with your economic hypothesis on Baugruppen. We are now for my taste, in the second wave of cooperative housing, Baugruppen. We had a big wave in the 1980s, which was not economically induced. It's out of social reasons that you became dissatisfied with individualistic solutions, and you joined with others to build up your Baugruppe. And this wave of the 1980s, to my opinion, was commercialized later. The housing companies took the model and made it in a standardized form, and now I'm observing a new movement of Baugruppen, which are used for branding, for introducing more activities, more solidarity in, for example, Seestadt, Aspern. These are the three waves, and they are not a reaction to crisis. They are grassroots movements of people who are dissatisfied with either supply by state housing or supply by private individualized housing. It's a good way. It offers a good way of living together with other people.
One could also say that basically it's another form of individualization. No?
particularly for the Austrian, for the Viennese scene of cooperative housing, or co-housing, basically. I think it's not so much comparable to what you showed, because it comes from a middle class background, and it's very little to do. I mean, it's seeking for a different form of living together, but not on such a highly politicized level as I think it is can be found here. So that would be the doubts to even compare the two. I'm not sure, but I'm also not sure if if it depends on the economic. If we can argue it or explain it by the economic background.
Well, of course, the question is how we define crisis. I showed two examples from the real collapse of the economy and the real collapse of politics, but we can define crisis as some kind of a permanent process when some social groups seem or see the situation around them as a crisis, as they are aware that something is going on around, they do not understand or they do not agree with what's going around, and so maybe if we change the definition of the crisis, also these Austrian examples may be a result of this process of a crisis in this broad sense of the word. Thank you very much for the remark about the one kitchen house or ein Küchenhaus. They were Czech architects were aware of these Austrian projects. They followed also before World War I. They followed German examples, Berlin, ein Küchenhäuser. So these solutions were known in the Czech Republic, but of course Karl Teige and Marxism did not appreciate them very much because they were not Marxist or Leninist in a strict sense of the word.
Could you maybe very quickly describe how living in such a type of house should look like? I mean, you showed the Tiger's example of the bed, which I think was amazing, but also kind of a daily routine of a person living there, how it was envisioned.
The collective house in Litvinov is the best and example of Czech collective houses. There were, I would say, luxurious flats, family flats, with a tiny kitchenette. You can see it in the back. So it served as a complete family unit. If you did not want to live collectively, you really did not have to. And of course there was a wide range of civic amenities and club rooms and places to meet each other. They were, but they were not used in the way architect presumed they would be. There was a few sociological investigations in collective houses in Litvinov and Zlín at the end of the 1950s, and these researches showed that none of these collective spaces is used the way it should be. The interest in collective services were much lower than it was expected.